7th. Ms. Peterson, will you please call the roll?
Chair Bendy White.
Here.
Grant House.
Here.
Frank Hotchkiss.
Here.
Thank you. And would you kindly read today's agenda item?
The item before you today is the Energy Efficiency Standards, the REACH Code.
Thank you. And this is the second meeting that we've had on the topic. And staff, would you like to give us a further presentation today? I probably will be brief, but catch us up to date.
Thank you, Chair White. My name is George Estrella, Chief Billing Official. With me today we have Mr. Mike Gable of Gable Associates, an engineering consultant. I'd also like to acknowledge some individuals in the audience today. Javier Mariscal with the Edison Company, Patricia Bartoli-Wibble of the Edison Company, Regional Manager, and Ronald Gorman of the Southern California Gas Company, all who were involved in the crafting and the pushing forward of this particular energy efficiency ordinance. A very brief background for the public. On September 28, 2010, a presentation was given to City Council by Mr. Mariscal of the Edison Company, in essence bringing forward an energy efficient ordinance that at that time would be 15% more energy efficient than current Title 24 energy regulations. After the Council's consideration, they asked staff to come back with a draft energy ordinance, have a public contact, and bring it forth to the city's ordinance committee, which was on November 16th. During that time, there was some discussion, and also during that time, we did find out that there was members of the public, in particular the lighting design industry folks, that were not aware of this energy ordinance moving forward. At that time, the Ordinance Committee directed staff to go back and meet with some of the individuals or interested members of the public, and also consider reducing for non-residential a push for 15% energy efficiency to 10%. So that meeting did take place on November 23rd. And I'd also like to acknowledge individuals who attended that particular meeting, because I thought it was a very interesting, it was a straightforward meeting. And while I'm not sure whether there is a 100% consensus, it was well worth the time spent. First, we had Mr. Tom Hughes, who was a mechanical engineer and actually performs the calculations within the various programs that come up with the energy efficiency criteria, the obvious programs that demonstrate compliance with Title 24 energy regulations. Mr. Paul Zink, who I also believe is in the audience today, architect. Daryl Dinehard, electrical solutions consultant, also in the audience today. Karen Feeney of Allen Associates. Lindsay Taggart of the Community Environmental Council. So those are the 5 public members that we met with and kind of hammered out a few changes. And so those changes are reflected in the ordinance brought to you today. The 2 significant changes, if I may add, are really on, you'll find them on page 3. And actually under section 22.82.030, applicability, specifically item B, which is the exception. In this, we provided clarification that in non-residential remodels or alterations, that specifically if a lighting design was being brought forward, that they would be exempted. In essence, it would take, we're looking more for a full tenant improvement, if you will, that where this would have to be considered in meeting the 10% above energy regulations criteria. So we wanted to clarify that, and I think that was something that was very agreeable with the energy design folks. The other item I'd like to bring to your attention is on page 6. And that's specifically under non-residential occupancies. It'd be C2B, which is a performance approach. And here we initially had 15% for non-residential buildings that they would have to comply. And of course, that has been changed to not less than or 10% now. So those were the significant changes that were discussed by the Ordinance Committee. And again, we had this put out on the city's webpage. We did put out the ordinance and information on our land development team bulletin, and it was put out through various websites, including the AIA, the Santa Barbara Contractors Association, CEC, and including the Illuminating Engineer Society webpage also, who these folks represent. So with that, that really concludes staff's comments, and we're open for questions, to respond to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Estrella. Are there questions of staff at this point?
Eventually, but do we want to hear public comment?
If you have questions for staff, that would be fine now, because that would inform the public comment. Mr. House?
Just on the first one of the changes, Mr. Estrella, on page 3, do I understand that this removes like a lighting only project? But if lighting were part of a project that had HVAC and building envelope components, how would that be folded in or not? Help me understand that, please.
Mr. Gable will address that.
Great, thank you.
That's correct. The intent here is that only projects which have changes to the mechanical system, the lighting system, and the envelope, all three components, would then be required to meet the ordinance performance requirements. So other typical alterations, which don't include all of them, would not be covered by the ordinance.
I understand. Thank you very much.
Good question. Mr. Hotchkiss?
Thank you. Just a couple of broad questions. If I have a home that was built in 1905 and I want to do a 500 square foot or more addition, how does this affect my home?
You have two choices. Either you show the addition by itself, without including the existing house, meets the energy code plus 15%, or you insulate an attic or do something to improve the existing house, which you get credit for, to improve the overall performance of the house. And in fact, most existing plus additions like that exceed the code by 15%, unless the house is very new in the last 10 years. It's a little harder. But otherwise, older homes typically have a lot of opportunities for some improvement that gets credited toward meeting this requirement.
And I mean, could you do it just with insulation?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if for example, you had let's say you had a house with a raised floor over a crawl space that was never insulated. If you have access to the crawl space, you could insulate between the floor and the crawl space. That would be one typical example of how to do it.
Okay, so you wouldn't have to replace windows?
No, I mean, I think that's the last thing people would have to do. In fact, you can upgrade water heaters, you can improve efficiency of wall heaters or furnaces, insulation. I mean, there are lots of things you could do to avoid windows, basically.
Any guesstimate on what that kind of cost is? Obviously, it depends on the size of the house.
Yeah, I mean...
Per square foot.
Yeah, per square foot. It's maybe, might be 80 cents, 90 cents, $1 a square foot, something like that.
Okay, in addition to the addition, as it were.
Yeah, in addition to the addition,
okay.
Right.
There goes into rather minute detail about spas and fountain pumps and all that stuff. Does this apply only to new pumps, or do we have to go backwards and retrofit?
It applies strictly to new swimming pools and spas. All right. And I might add that the requirements for the motors are really highly rated energy efficient motors. They're dual speed. And so the return on those are quite quickly.
Okay. But the dual speed, does that apply also to fountains? Like I thought it did to water features. It seems to me that it reads that way. And I think we're talking about tiny little motors that, first off, they're not available in dual speed.
Right. I would concur with you that it does say water features, and maybe
we should.
Mr. Gable might add if it was intended.
I mean, you really are. We're not talking about the little fountains out back that you want a dual speed motor on.
If there's language that would make that clear to eliminate some small category which doesn't make quite sense, that'd be fine.
Yes, on page 4 of the ordinance, section 2282.050, the mandatory energy efficiency requirements. This is where the rubber meets the road as far as the spas, water features, and so forth. And those circulation pump requirements only apply if the nominal rating of the pump is 3/4 of a horsepower or greater.
Right.
So if you have a minor fountain, and I'll let the the technical gentleman can correct me if I'm wrong, a small household fountain probably doesn't require more than a 3/4 horsepower pump. If it does, then I think you're talking about that's the whole point. That it's a big pump.
All right, well, I think we should, I mean, we make a lot more sense and have a lot more support if we eliminated fountains and stuff like that, because I don't really know, and it's sometimes hard to tell what the actual output is. It's certainly less than a horsepower. But anyway, I think that language could be improved. Will reach codes be a part of zoning inspections?
No, reach codes are not part of zoning inspections. That's a completely different format altogether.
Okay, so if I don't, let's say I've not retrofitted my swimming pool properly, it won't be a red flag in my zoning report if when I go to sell my house?
Correct. Just for clarity, if a property owner is selling their residence and you have existing facilities, the zoning code is primarily looking at code violations in terms to unsafe items or illegal things. Now, if something was built at the time, it may be existing nonconforming, and that use will continue. But the zoning code would not go back and try to lay over the proposed energy efficiency standards. That's not the intent of this ordinance at all. This only deals when it's a new building or there's an addition to the building, be it residential or commercial. So simply going out on ZIR, zoning information report, no, it does not trigger those requirements.
Okay. One point it mentions exclusions for display lighting. Is that, we're talking about commercial display lighting there?
Yes, and actually that's under the so-called prescriptive lighting option. Someone does not have to use that compliance approach to meet this requirement. They can use what's called the performance approach. But to answer your question, that means in retail stores or wherever they're using the display lighting option or credit within the Title 24 calculations, that lighting is exempt from this requirement.
Well, here's a really niggling thing, but I can see it coming up. Let's say somebody has a sculpture. They're doing a 700 square foot addition. They have sculptures, paintings, and stuff. Could they use the lights that are focused on those particular objects as display lighting? Because that's really what they are. They're not ambient lighting.
You're talking about commercial buildings, obviously.
No, I'm talking about residential.
Oh, this doesn't. That has nothing to do with residential
Okay.
buildings. This is only for commercial buildings where, to show compliance with the lighting requirements for the state, there is a way you can get credit for the display lighting to sort of take it off the books, to not count it or have to count it as part of this.
Thank you. That's my questions for staff.
Thank you, Mr. Hotchkiss. All right, I'll open the public portion of this hearing. The first speaker is Darrell Deinhardt, to be followed by Paul Zink. And I've got 2 minutes on the clock there for each speaker.
Good afternoon. I think this ordinance is wrong for this community. I'm opposed to this ordinance on many levels. I think it's cumbersome, not cost-effective, involves more bureaucracy, creates design, building permit, and cost obstacles that are not properly identified. It creates nonconformity of design requirements between communities. Under findings, the findings are flawed. No data has been provided that Santa Barbara is subject to future utility power outages during peak periods. Records from SCE over the last 5 years showing the amount of power delivered to all of Santa Barbara City and Goleta Valley have not shown any significant increase and in some cases decreases in power usage. We have not experienced any power outages, blackouts due to increases in peak energy over the past several years, if any at all. It has not been shown that this ordinance will result in significant reduction of energy costs for the owners or tenants of buildings. City staff has only reviewed a report by an independent consultant of whom used an imaginary building to substantiate real-life building energy savings. A building design that does not deal with current Title 24 lighting switching issues, required lighting levels, nor a comprehensive method of dealing with these issues. Interesting on Section 2 why the CEQA requirements that actually provide a means to identify in a community whether a project would have a significant effect on the environment is being excluded by this ordinance. That requirement alone would determine whether or not additional ordinance or requirements were required in savings energy. But it's been eliminated in this proposed ordinance. This ordinance does not include any means for appeal should the requirements not be able to be met with conventional cost-effective means, nor issues that may contain hardship or replacement due to natural disaster. We do not have a like-for-like proposal in this that I can see. There is no significant compelling data that demonstrates the City of Santa Barbara should take on the task of assuming that they are better equipped and qualified to create an ordinance.
Mr. Deinhardt,
Am I done?
wrap up. Yeah. Could you provide your comments to a written version of your comments to staff, please, to over here?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Paul Zink, to be followed by Dennis Thompson.
Hello, my name is Paul Zink, and I'm an architect. I'm an AIA member, and I'm also a member of the Built Green. I've done a house that's been 38% greater than the energy requirements, but I also have done a house that is 0.4% greater than the energy requirements, and another one that was 1.5% greater than the energy requirements. The reason why I'm here is not because I'm against the increased energy efficiency. I'm against the idea of making it mandatory. There are many people in this community that go above and beyond because they want to and because they're willing to. But there is a cost associated to it, and that has to be understood. At 70 cents, $1 a square foot, you're looking at $700, $1,200, $1,500 that you're asking somebody to pay just because we have unique climate conditions that require such an ordinance. But let me ask you this. Do we really have unique local climate conditions that warrant this ordinance? That's in the first sentence here, and that's not true. All up and down the coast of California, there is not a unique situation here that requires us to exceed the Title 24 requirements. The Title 24 requirements are going to be upgraded in an incremental fashion so that we can reach the goals that are laid out for 2030. That is fine. We have Built Green, and you give us incentives like expedited plan check so that when we do exceed the energy requirements, we can get our building permit quicker than other people, so I can use that as justification for 98% efficient gas FAU in the attic. So I'd like you to consider, or at least make reference to, that you are making an increased burden on some people who pull building permits.
Thank you, Mr. Zink. Dennis Thompson, to be followed by Ann Kale.
Good afternoon. I'm Dennis Thompson of Thompson Naylor Architects, and as I said a couple of weeks ago, I've been living under this ordinance, a previous version of it, for the last 2 years, at which time it's been 20% beyond Title 24, and haven't found a project where it was hard to achieve, haven't found a client who complained about extra costs. Now we have found a good compromise, I think. All the consultants that I work with said that 15% for residential, 10% for commercial is readily achievable. And I think part of the reason that we should do it here is that we can do it here. Our climate is mild. It's easier here than if we were in a more extreme climate in the state. So I and many of the other architects, including the AIA, I don't think there's an AIA representative here today, but I believe the AIA board has endorsed this consistently.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Ann Kale, to be followed by Karen Feeney. How do I get two up there?
Hello, I'm an architectural lighting designer practicing here in Santa Barbara. I'm here in support of the ordinance. I'm a big believer in any kind of energy efficiency type of ordinance. I think this is reasonable. Does bringing in a building for lower watts per square foot, does it incur higher costs? Typically it does. I won't deny that. But the payback periods are impressive. It's not in the first year, it's not in the second year, but definitely you can see paybacks within 4 or 5 years. We recently did a job down in Santa Monica. The payback was in 5 years, and if you look at it longer, another 5 years, and our client is actually making money. They're making 7% on their initial investment of going energy efficient. That's a pretty good payback and investment in these trying times. The best story I can tell you is that we have a local client who's nationwide showrooms. When she finally had to do the California showroom, it forced her into more expensive equipment, more efficient equipment. The lighting is better, the payback is great, and that is now the standard for all of our showrooms, no matter what state we're in. As far as the initial cost, yes. But the $500 or the 88 cents per square foot, the client is going to see that come back to them over and over and over again, even if they don't stay in the house for the entire payback period. That's it.
Thank you very much. Karen Feeney to be followed by Lindsay Taggart.
Good afternoon. I'm Karen Feeney. I'm with Allen Associates, a general contractor here in Santa Barbara. As Mr. Estrella mentioned, I was at the November 23rd meeting, and I appreciated Mr. Estrella's efforts to pull us all together to have a conversation about this. And I also just wanted to mention that Trish Reynoso was also in attendance at that meeting. I don't know that you mentioned her name earlier. I really appreciated the concerns and the issues that were raised by the lighting community at that time, and I felt that at the table, I felt when we left that room that we had reached consensus about this, that some positive changes had been incorporated into the ordinance to make it most effective. It was ready to go forward. So I'm fairly surprised to hear Mr. Dinan's comments today and the strength of them given that meeting. I also want to mention that Allen Associates did provide a series of case studies at the City Council that showed that buildings could be built as much as 15% or more better than Title 24 cost effectively, and the technologies are readily available to do that. The state of California has set a goal that all buildings in the state be energy neutral by the year 2020, not 2030, but 2020. And I think what's happened is that the state actually has not caught up with itself as far as amending Title 24 to reach its own goal. So I think if we can do this in our own community, then we're ahead of the game. And it's important for the long term to build our buildings as energy efficient as possible, and to do it now. So I really encourage you to adopt the ordinance as it's been amended and move it forward so the full council can consider it. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Feeney. Lindsay Taggart, and the last speaker is Dan George. Unless there are others that want to speak, in which case please get a slip in.
Good afternoon. Thanks for the opportunity to speak on behalf of the Community Environmental Council. Just wanted to go on record in support of this ordinance and urge you to push it forward to the City Council for a full review there. Don't need to belabor the point. I feel that the community representatives here have done a great job in showing their support and bringing forth all of the strong points behind and all the benefits behind this ordinance, and just wanted to reinforce the fact that the local AIA, the Santa Barbara Contractors Association, Built Green, various community groups in the building industry here in Santa Barbara support this. Their records and their experiences have shown that it's actually quite easy to do, and that the public, their clients, are actually asking for these types of efficiency improvements and efficiency levels in their construction projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Dan George is the last speaker, unless there's somebody else.
Hi, I'm Dan George. I'm here on behalf of the Santa Barbara Contractors Association, board member. And I wanted to remind you, gentlemen, that the Santa Barbara Contractors Board of Directors unanimously voted to back this. We spent a lot of time with this. This is our business. We see a lot of dollars going past our businesses about these kinds of issues. And largely, we think this is an excellent idea because it will create jobs, and also it will put our local businesses slightly ahead of the curve of what's coming down the pike in the state anyways. Typically, we look at the additional costs for these energy conservation items as being fairly minimal. And if you look at it in terms of the lifespan of the investment, it's a great return on investment. Our clients typically are overwhelmingly supportive of these kinds of energy saving things. And I want to thank you, gentlemen, for your thoughtful consideration of all this, but please let this go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. George. Last call. Oh, all right, well then it's back to the committee. Comments?
Yes.
I think Mr. House actually clicked. Okay, Mr. Hotchkiss.
Mr. Stray, did we talk to, I assume we talked to AIA and Contractors Association, some of whom were here. Did we talk to end users in the business community about their feeling on this? The downtown organization, for instance?
No, not specifically. We did advertise it, and we did have a public meeting, and we hope to get the word out. But no representatives did attend from the downtown community. Let
me read something also from the, or in addition from the, from Steve Cushman of the Chamber. He said, Thanks for the heads up. We've not taken this matter up yet. It certainly seems like the wrong time to increase fees, especially when they cannot be recaptured by savings quickly, Steve. Downtown organization says, hey, we didn't know anything about this either. So I can understand if I was an architect, I think I would support this. I'm really an implementer, and, you know, it's sort of on that side of the fence, but I'm really worried about the other side of the fence, if I can put it that way. The people that really are the end users who are going to be ultimately paying for this. And I know the sympathies on elsewhere on this committee are to do anything that's energy saving, and I understand that. I'm just wondering if now's the right time to be doing this when we're actually kind of volunteering to be more stringent than an already very, I think you would characterize as very stringent state requirements that are going to get more so. And when we say in our general plan update that we want to do everything to encourage businesses to come here, and say, oh, by the way, it's going to cost you a little bit more if you want to build here or whatever. I'm not sure of the wisdom of that. I'm not saying this is bad, but I'm just saying maybe we should forward it with the proviso to the council. It's like, look, it's got good things, it's got not so good things. We're really not going to take a position. At least we're divided. Let's take a careful look at this and not just kind of rubber stamp it, which I think is our tendency sometimes when it comes to energy stuff. I think Mr. Zink had a good point. Maybe we want to add that it should be voluntary, and that would make it so those who are enthusiastic supporters, as the lady from Allen Associates mentioned, and you from the Contractors Association, your clients that you talk to that really like it, but give those that are not so enthusiastic, maybe because their purse is a little tighter or smaller, the chance to opt out. When it comes to new construction. So I'm just saying, from a business-friendly point of view, maybe we ought to be very cautious and say, good idea, let's look at it and down the line when things are a little bit healthier economically. Thanks, gentlemen.
Mr. Hotchkiss. Mr. House?
Well, I appreciate the sentiment and the concern that's just been raised. And I feel fairly confident in speaking for businesses who occupy buildings, who rent buildings, who are tenants of buildings, that anything that could reduce our utility bill is a direct benefit to our business in a difficult business and climate. So if I were looking for a place now to locate my business, and I had an option between a place that had really old, antiquated, or even at the current level, and a place that was more modern and had the kind of things we're talking about here, I would see that as a direct offset to the cost of rent.
Well, sure, but you're going to pay for it.
And well, maybe that's one way of looking at it, but I really think that this is an important piece of the equation. If the point is that somehow there are additional costs. So one of the things that was raised as a concern, I'd like to understand better, what is the increase in fees that are directly associated with this, Mr. Estrella?
From a billing standpoint of view, there are no increase in fees.
Okay, so Mr. Cushman's concern about increasing fees in this difficult business climate would be addressed by there's no additional fees.
Correct.
Okay, so no additional fees and a reduction in utility bills for the businesses that are occupying the commercial structures, and then we're hearing from the residential development community, and there seems to be a little bit of two minds there, the concern about the prescriptive nature of it. I understand there's two different methods that we're offering in terms of the calculations. One was called a prescriptive version of the approach, and the other is performance-based. And would you just take a little bit of time with us on that? We talked about it last time, but I want to be sure there's flexibility there where somebody's not being backed into a corner to do something that really isn't appropriate, especially in like historic structures or things like Mr. Hotchkiss is talking about, but they can get there from here by creative means.
Mr. Gable will address that question.
All right, thank you.
Well, first to be clear, there's no prescriptive option on the residential side because no one uses the prescriptive approach normally. 99% of people use the performance approach anyway. In commercial buildings, the permit applicant has the option in new construction to use a performance approach to exceed the energy code by 10%. And the local consultants here tell me, and it's my experience, that most everyone will use that. However, if the permit applicant wants to have a lighting designer or chooses to have the lighting design meet the prescriptive requirement separate from the performance, that is to do it in separate components, the envelope and the lighting separately, the ordinance gives them a way to do that, but they're not required to do it that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. And then another concern, which I can understand that, I mean, we have a little fountain outside of our house. It's got one of those little tiny motors in it and just kind of keeps going, and it's really beautiful, little tinkly sound of the water. I work with electric motors all the time in my work, and those have less than 1/20th of a horsepower. I mean, that's 0.05 horsepower. A 3/4 horsepower motor is a very powerful motor. That's for a big installation. That's a major water feature, not a small one. That would be a very large fountain or water feature that, I mean, I'm trying to think of how that would work. I guess it'd be a pretty good sized swimming pool kind of. Well, swimming pools are already covered in there. So I mean, this is not the little, please confirm this, because this is my understanding with the work I do with motors. These little guys don't suck a whole lot, and they're being exempt.
Right. This 3/4 of a horsepower is, I'm not sure the actual flow rates associated with them exactly, but they're large pools. They're major water features. They're not small little, even a small public fountain that wouldn't reach this threshold.
Right, don't even qualify.
Large pumps which use a lot of energy, essentially.
So first of all, I really would agree with the concern if we were going down to the smaller level, and we're not. And I appreciate our attorney catching that and calling it to our attention. And then the last piece was a concern that was raised about where the significant environmental impact piece was pulled out of this, because this isn't being used as basically in the CEQA context. It's really about addressing the opportunity that by affecting over time a large number of very small situations, that you have an aggregate effect, an aggregate impact to the grid, and doing this consistently and community by community and across the state, and ultimately in another couple of years with Title 24 going through its upgrade, can then have a significant impact. But we're doing this on the small incremental level where there's not a great big gigantic cost. I really support what we have here, and one of the things I do appreciate, Mr. Estrella, thank you for convening or creating that opportunity to convene the folks that got a chance to get around and talk about this. And I think there was some wisdom in the approach of let's see, this 2282030B exception that, if you're just doing lighting, you're already going to be putting in more efficient lighting features anyway, so that's just already making an improvement. But it's the bigger projects, the HVAC, building envelope, lighting, those are the ones at the local level we want to create this benefit. So I'll wait for your comments, Mr. Chair, but I tend to support what we have here, especially including those that most recent couple of revisions.
Thank you, Mr. House. Mr. Hopkins, did you have a comment that you wanted to make in response? Okay.
Well, actually, yeah, just one. Whereas Mr. Cushman did mention, he used the word fees, what he's talking about is construction costs and that. That's what.
Right. So, additional cost.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I appreciate the process that's gone on here, where we discovered an area of concern, and at least we made some progress there. And clearly, Mr. Deinhardt didn't come all the way there, but it sounds like we have at least made some progress in addressing that concern. My concern here goes back to sort of I look at the big picture of we're sending billions of dollars a month to countries that don't like us. We have a climate that is changing by our cause. These are things that we are leaving for our children and grandchildren that I feel like we are not, and we're also the energy hogs of the world. You look at the average amount of energy that we use in this country per person, and it's greater than Sweden, where the temperatures are Arctic. It dismays me, and so this is our contribution, our small contribution to setting. I won't even call it an example, but at least at least making a contribution, making some effort. So it's and then as the one who develops homes, I know what 80 cents a square foot is about, and I know that I could handle that. So I'm supportive, and I'm also curious to see. I don't want us to be chewing on this some more and more and more. I appreciate Mr. Hotchkiss's point that the downtown organization doesn't know about this. Let's make sure that we are. I'm going to back up a step. This is not off the cuff. We have the Contractors Association, we have Edison, we have the gas company. We have, I mean, it's extraordinary that we have these entities coming forward with these suggestions. This is not just harebrained out of left field. This is mainstream, and I appreciate the effort that's gone into it. So I also want this to be vetted in the community fully, and I think we can do that at council. And I'm curious to see philosophically where this council lands on it. I don't want us to spend more staff time on it if we're going nowhere. I'd like to see what we have in the way of a foundation before we spend particularly more staff time on it. But we do need to get downtown organization, have a fully vetted meeting at council, and I ask staff to make sure that we really get that word out. So I will be supporting moving this forward, and I appreciate the changes that have been made, and I really appreciate that our community has worked at this, at least to make some changes that dial this in a little closer to a constructive ordinance. Mr. House?
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll make a motion. I mean, for something that does reduce utility bills, that does not increase fees, and that has a very minor cost, really, in the larger development scheme of thing, with definite I say definite, that's not right, with a sense that the payback for these kinds of things is something that's manageable and that can be realized, and then continues to give back in terms of energy efficiency long after payback has been realized. So I move that we recommend for approval to the City Council an ordinance establishing local energy efficiency standards for new construction and most additions. And separate from the motion, I want to thank Mr. Hotchkiss for raising those concerns, because they need to be highlighted, and I think the answers do come out favorably and in support of us doing this. So my motion is to approve to move this to City Council.
And I'll second it.
Could I, just as a point of discussion, say I would vote for this if we would say optional.
I appreciate that. And as I say, I know that will be a focal point at our council meeting, and so thank you for bringing that up. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Opposed. Okay, so the motion passes. But you do, Mr. Hotchkiss, support this going to council, at least for discussion purposes. Is that the case?
That's where it's got to go.
But you support that?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for coming today and making your thoughts known, and look forward to this coming to council for a further review.